Okay, superrealism. Superrealism is also known as photorealism because the superrealist painters and drawers would use photography as a tool to help stage and prepare the different scenes that they were trying to develop. And like the pop artist, the super realist wanted to connect with the public. So it was a way to make anyone and everyone that's part of society find some kind of relatable merit in the artwork. So instead of it being super cerebral like we saw with the abstract expressionists and even the post-painterly abstractions and even the minimalist, they wanted something a little more relatable and not this upper echelon of being able to understand and categorize what art is. They wanted it to have recognizable features. So that's why the super realists will often paint or develop a scene that has some kind of association with day-to-day activities, even as simple as looking at yourself in the mirror before you walk out the door. It's boiled down to relatable objects, like what pop art wanted to do. The super realists want to do the same thing. So they will actually develop images based on optical facts. And they'll use the photo as the source. So that's your optical fact right there, is when you take a photo of something, it's an optical fact. There's no obscuring it or changing it unless you take it into a manipulated tool like Photoshop or Illustrator. Then the graphic arts, then it becomes a graphic art. But prior to that, without any manipulation and no use of filters or anything like that, it's called an optical fact. It's a truth, okay? So they wanted, their super realism motto was to keep it real and as this optical fact. And then from that photography, on capturing that optical fact, then they rendered the painting or the drawing based off of that photography. All right, so, and they made the work much larger than the photography. For example, a Polaroid is very small, but then if you look at figure 3131, acrylic on canvas, 8 foot tall by almost 7 foot tall painting of Chuck Close and his big self-portrait. So taking a small scaled photograph and then being able to blow it up to this size based off of your painterly and your drawing skills. Now, photograph today, you can do that. You can print out a large high definition image unpixelated at this scale, 8 foot by 7 foot. But prior to in 1967 and 1968, that was not available. That was not an option. So Chuck Close would take his super realistic painting skills and magnify it and make it this large. But with Chuck Close, he really wanted to make sure that we knew that realism is not the end. That is not the whole purpose. That is not the end. It is meant to be used to develop intellectually rigorous and systematic approach to painting. All right, so it's essentially used to teach you the technique on how to make something very rigorous and systematic become successful, and using your intelligence on being able to transfer your ideas of something in a photograph over onto a large scale canvas painting is part of the intellect that's required to get to the ultimate goal of a rigorous and systematic development of painting. So the realism is just really a conduit or an avenue to get you to these technical abilities. And that's what Chuck Close believed. And Hansen, we'll look at a sculpture, believed the same. And that's going to be figure 3133. And the same concepts apply, like what we just saw with Close with his painting, but here it's going to be sculpture. And what Hansen did was he learned how to cast life-size humans, and by appendage by appendage. So what he did is he created a plaster mold of an individual, of the arm, let's say the lower arm, and then a cast of the upper arm, then the upper bust in the front and in the back, and then also the face, the head, the legs, everything was casted in plaster, individual pieces. Then in those molds, those are called molds, M-O-L-D-S, molds. Then inside of those molds, what he did is he casted polyester resin. So he casted resin inside of those molds, broke the shell of the plaster mold off, or used some kind of lubricant or resistor where when the resin set up inside of that plaster, it didn't stick to the plaster that much, and he was able to pry the plaster pieces apart in what are called 2 or 3-piece molds, pry them apart, and then you could reuse that plaster mold later. He would do one or the other. Either he shattered the cast of the mold with the plaster and just didn't redo that again, or he tries to salvage it, depending on if he wanted to replicate the person that he was casting. But anyway, filled it with the resin, and then after the resin dried or solidified, not dried, solidified. So whenever something is liquidous for painting, it dries to the touch. When it's something that is sculptural, it cures or it solidifies to the touch. So that's the difference in the drying terminology between something that's a painting and something that is sculptural or three-dimensional. After it's solidified in the mold, he removed the mold, either broke the mold shell off or separated it somehow. Then he cleaned up the resin, and then after cleaning the resin, he painted it with just a tone, just a base tone, and then he came in and airbrushed it. And then he pieced all the individual pieces of resin together, interlocking them underneath the clothing and accessories that he would add on top of the body, right? And then if you look at figure 3133, which is the supermarket shopper, you can see how he's doing that. And then incorporating the accessories like the grocery basket with the food that's in the grocery basket. Again, the whole point of superrealism is to connect people and the public with what's going on in the art. So he took the theme of the everyday person at this time that was going to shop for the food that was going to bring it back into the home. So he wanted to have this relatable figure, so whenever you step into the gallery, you're like, why is that lady here with the shopping cart? And you find out, oh, wait a second. Through this super realism or this photorealism, I'm able to relate and understand why art has this empowering ability for communication. And he wanted to display the average American and have it familiar in nature. It was all about a familiarity. And that's what he did well with Supermarket Shopper. Then, also during this time in the 60s and 70s, you're going to have the feminist art movement that's going to develop. So in the 70s, it's going to be very much about investigating power and privilege, like who has the power and who has the privilege. And the women are the ones who are going to be leading the way on equal rights and equal societies at this time. And Judy Chicago, figure 3136, is going to be one of those leaders of the pack. And the dinner party is really going to become a staple of the feminist art movement during this time in the 60s and 70s. Her whole point was to educate the role of women in art to everybody. So to educate women on the important historical inclusions that they've been part of throughout history and societies, but also everybody else. So in making sure that everybody is aware of the intertwining elements of what women have done in history. And she did it in a very particular way with the dinner party. She used craft materials like ceramics, china painting, and needlework, which are often associated with women throughout history. And so she wanted to use very specific materials, craft-based materials that have been used predominantly by women than men throughout history, and then combine all these craft techniques into this piece of fine art. So combining all of this history and then interweaving it together into this large triangulated shape called the dinner party to make it now officially a fine art through the feminist lens, right? So that's the idea. It's supposed to be like the Last Supper with 13 guests, but all the guests are women. No, there's no men present at this dinner party. But she found so many acclaimed women throughout history that had a huge impact in art history as well as history in general, that it grew to 39, and she stopped at 39 because she didn't want it to go beyond 48 inches on or 48 feet on each side. So each segment of the triangle is 48 feet long. So that just gives you an idea on how vast this piece is, the dinner party. And she used the triangle, and in this position here, it's an inverted triangle, also known as a pubic triangle, and that is often an ancient symbol connected with maternity, which is the feminine aspect of motherhood and the feminine aspect of fertility goddesses and such. So that's why she has this triangular orientation, because it's because of the ability to become pregnant and to bear offspring that that this symbol has a strong representation throughout history. So again, it's triangulated in this way for women, and also for the idea of the goddess figures that have been seen throughout art history as well. And she chose it to be a dinner party because, again, that associates with domestic affairs. So, again, taking all of these different craft techniques, combining them with the domestic affairs of preparing food in the home for everybody's well being, composing all of that, bringing it all together into this triangulated, ancient symbolic composition to give rise to the importance of women throughout history as well as throughout art history. So that's Judy Chicago. And now let's take a look at Sherman, Cindy Sherman, figure 3138. She, instead of using sculptural elements or painting elements, used photography. And she wanted to discuss gender as a socially constructed concept. And how she would do that is she would use herself to change how women were seen in their gender role in society, by using herself in different positions and different frames to indicate the importance of socially constructed concepts on what roles were meant to be associated with males and what roles were meant to be associated with females. So this is called Untitled Film, still number 35, and she wanted it to look like a film scene. Right? She wanted it to look like this sudden snapshot in this film scene. She wanted it to be generic. She didn't want it to be overly decorative or ornamentated, because, again, like with the super realists and the pop artists, the feminist artists were really wanted you to be able to be relatable to the imagery, so that you can connect to it and communicate the power of it a little bit better than some of the more cerebral based arts that we saw at the beginning of this chapter. And one real cool thing about what Sherman would do is she would leave the shutter cable or the cord, and at that time there had to be a cord that ran to the camera with a little button on the end of the shutter cable, and when you push that button, the shutter opens, takes the picture, and then it closes. And she leaves the cord in there. You can see the bottom left, the cord running back towards the frame of the door, and then her right hand, which is not seen in the photo, is holding that shutter cable. And the reason she did that is she wanted to emphasize the importance of feminine independence, that she didn't need anybody behind the camera, and it's just her own personal sovereignty and her own personal independence, that she can take these photos without the assistance of anyone, especially without the assistance of any male. And so she intentionally left those cords in there to reflect that personal independence that she has as a feminist artist. All right, so that's Cindy Sherman. Then what's going to happen is there's going to be an environmental movement in the 60s and 70s, and there's going to be artwork that's going to be based off of environmentalism. And we're going to look at figure 3152, Smithson Spiral Jetty. So these are called Earthworks. Earthworks, Earthworks, and they're meant to be site specific. SITESPECIFIC, site specific. And what that means is that they're meant to be unique for that place in an open aired location. All right? They're not meant to be within the confines of any architectural structure. They're meant to be in the open atmosphere, the open air, but they're designed for very specific, unique places. All right, that's what makes it called. That's why we call it a site-specific, also known as earthworks. And these earthworks are a combination, or they're somewhere, not a combination, they're somewhere in between architecture and sculpture. Architecture and sculpture. They're kind of in this little sliver of materialism, or the use of certain materials that are in between architecture and sculpture. They are very organic and natural materials that are being used. And the reason these pieces really came about is because of the increase of environmentalism in the 60s and 70s. So after the Great Wars and the use of all these consumer goods that are producing all kinds of toxic byproducts in the manufacturing companies, the environmentalists, the EPA in particular, was developed at this time. It gave rise to individuals that really wanted to make a statement and say something about how the impact machines are on the earth and on the environment. So Smithson actually intentionally used with Spiral Jetty very heavy equipment to show that purpose. So what he did is, first of all, what the environmentalist artists are doing is they're taking what has been conventionally known as artwork that is supposed to be inside of a gallery or a museum, and using the earth actually as the gallery or the museum, which is kind of a new concept at this time. So moving art out of the museum and the galleries, and then documenting it either with video recording later or with photography during this time. But what Smithson did is he used industrial equipment to manipulate the earth and the rock on these isolated sites. So by using heavy industrial construction equipment, like diggers, bulldozers, and anything that's going to move the earth and shift these rocks, cranes and such, to develop this form, is to show you what, if you intentionally use these huge mechanical instruments, what can do and how long lasting that will be, like we see here. And then how that is obvious here in this site-specific piece that hasn't changed all that much since it was developed in 1970, what those machines are doing subconsciously and indirectly in the overall makeup of the earth. So this spiral jetty is supposed to be a symbolic representation of what these big machines can do in the earth whenever you intentionally use them, and then can you imagine what impact they're actually having unintentionally. So that's kind of the point, is to show you what these large machines are really doing and how impactful they are in a negative way, according to environmentalists. Okay, then figure 3152A. I know this is a lot of information here. There's a lot of different things changing at this time. We have the beginnings of what's called performance art. And what performance artists are wanting to do, instead of using your traditional and conventional materials like paint or sculpting materials or architectural materials, they wanted to essentially use their own movements, their own gestures, and their own sounds to create art. And you will have the performance artist only focusing on those movements, those gestures, and those sounds. Now, at the very beginning of performance art, there was no video camera, so the actual performance could only be documented by photography. So not in many of the very beginning performance pieces were not fully documented. There were just a few photographs from time to time. Performance artists require an audience, and the audience sometimes participate in the performance, making it what's known as an interactive performance art. So if it's just a performance art and there's an event where the artist is performing and the audience is not interacting, it's just called performance art. And the performer is separate from the audience, typically on a stage or in a room that's being viewed, like with figure 3152A, Joseph Bowes, How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hair. He is removed and isolated from the audience, but you can walk by and look through the mirror or through the window and see into this isolated space. That's called a performance event. Whenever the audience is actually interacting with the performance, it's called interactive performance art. And there typically isn't a stage involved. It's on the same ground or the same level as the audience. But whenever the artist is separated and placed into an isolated space and you're observing it, or up on a stage and you're listening to it but you're not interacting with it, that's what we would call performance art event. E-V-E-N-T, event. And so Joseph Bowes, How to Explain a Picture to a Dead Hair is an event. It's a performance art event because he was separated from he was separated from the audience and they were not interacting. Now, one thing that needs to be emphasized is that it's not theater. Okay, theater is whenever the performers are separated from the audience, but it's augmented based off of decoration, based off of themes, based off of costumes, based off of set design. That's theater art. Performance art is none of that stuff is staged. None of that is pre-thought out. No environment is being changed. No costumes are being developed for it. Okay, performance art is just you as a vessel generating movements, gestures, and sounds. Okay? And they did follow a compositional score. Now, what that means is they set up series of actions and series of movements and series of gestures and series of sounds to come in at certain times. So, for example, with Bowes, How to Explain a Picture to a Dead Hair, is part of his compositional score was to raise his finger even though his face was coated with wax and actual animal fat, where you can't see his mouth move, and plus he's trapped in this isolated space where nobody can hear what he's saying, and he lifts his finger up, and that's part of his compositional score, using this movement and gesture of his hand and his leg and his feet and the cradling of the hair as part of this performance art. And that's what we call a compositional score. All right, and that's just one example here with Bowes, How to Explain a Picture to a Dead Hair. Then our last is conceptual art. And conceptual art is considered, we're going to look at figure 3156, the logical end result of avant-garde. And what we mean by that is that we're at a place now where people are conceiving of ideas and they're using new formulated materials to get to that idea. So you think about it with Duchamp, and we talked about with the fountain as a Dadaist, and I mentioned it's conceptual, meaning that it's all about the thought of the artwork, like what is this art really? He found something that was already made and produced and then just altered it, the urinal to the fountain. Here we're at the logical absolute end of avant-garde and conceptualism, meaning you conceive of an idea, you conceive of a material that you want to alter and fabricate to create it, and that's what Newman is doing here with the true artist helps the world by revealing mystic truths. And what he did as a conceptualist, he conceived of what the design and composition needed to look like, but he wanted to use a different and new material for that conception. So what he did is he made the object using neon lights. Okay, so neon lights became the conceived use of material for this this piece of artwork, figure 3156. And he used the neon because it's a non-artistic function at first. So the use of neon lights was not originally used for artistic purposes. So that's why he was conceiving of how he can use a material that's not often produced for artistic or fine art reasons, and then he's conceiving how he can manipulate and alter this neon lighting to serve his needs for his conceptual art. And then he also drew on contradiction and nonsense with the statement. And what the statement is very much about is this satirical idea of how often some folks will just say something outlandish out loud just to kind of get a reaction and see if anybody believes them or not. And so the statement itself is supposed to be on that kind of contradictory, nonsensical movement of thought that couples with the conceptual idea of how people were labeling conceptual art, which is that this is a contradiction to conventional, traditional art, as well as it's very nonsensical. How can you make art out of materials that are common day, like lights, fluorescent lights, neon lights that were used for more theatrical purposes? And so the statement itself is a contradiction in a nonsense, and then so does the use of the neon lights. It has a contradiction and a nonsense to a conventionalist. But to somebody who is conceptual in thought and forward thinking, the use of neon lights as an art material and the statement itself actually has some relevance and some sensible substance to it. And that's what makes it conceptual art. Okay, I'll leave you at that for chapter 31, and we'll get into chapter 32 real soon.